Victor Hale believed he knew exactly what kind of woman Claire Bennett was before she ever opened her mouth. That was his gift, or at least the gift television had rewarded for 27 years. He could glance at a guest, study the shoes, the posture, the nervous hands, the misplaced smile, and decide within seconds where the pressure point would be. A senator needed to be challenged on numbers. A prosecutor needed to be cornered on hypocrisy. A young activist needed to be interrupted until emotion replaced argument. A quiet middle-aged woman in a cream-colored sweater, seated at the far end of a national debate panel, needed only to be made visible long enough to look small. The bright studio lights of the National Forum debate burned against polished black floors as camera operators moved between marks and producers counted down through headsets. Rows of audience members filled the theater seats, many dressed in dark suits and expensive dresses, their low conversations blending with the hum of cameras, the whisper of makeup brushes, and the sharp click of cue cards being stacked. At the center of it all stood Victor Hale, America's favorite debate moderator, famous for dismantling guests with razor-sharp questions and a smile that looked charming until it turned against you. At 52, Victor carried himself with the ease of a man who had spent decades controlling rooms. His silver tie caught the light. His hair had been corrected twice. His jacket sat perfectly across his shoulders. On a small monitor near the stage, last week's ratings report waited like an accusation. A producer leaned close to Victor's earpiece and murmured, "We need a moment tonight. The network wants clips before the first break." Victor did not look away from his reflection in the darkened teleprompter glass. For one brief second, he remembered when he used to hate this kind of television. Years ago, before the awards and contracts and morning headlines, he had believed interviews were supposed to reveal truth, not manufacture humiliation. Then the red standby light blinked above camera 2, the producer counted down in his ear, and the old instinct returned. "Then give me the weakest guest first," he said. Across the stage, Claire Bennett adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored sweater and folded her hands neatly in front of her. Unlike the politicians and media personalities surrounding her, Claire looked painfully ordinary. Her light brown hair rested softly against her shoulders, untouched by expensive styling. No flashy jewelry, no power suit, no practiced television smile. Just a calm expression, a stack of handwritten notes, and a leather folder placed carefully beside a thin paper cup of water. Senator Langley had been given a crystal glass on a slate coaster. Ethan Cole had a bottle poured for him by a production assistant. Claire's cup had a small bend near the rim, as if someone had grabbed it too quickly from a catering stack and decided it was good enough for the woman at the end of the table. Some audience members barely glanced at her. Others openly did double takes, confused why someone who looked like a local librarian had been invited onto a nationally televised policy debate. A sound technician moved down the panel, checking each guest's lapel microphone with careful taps and short instructions. He asked Senator Langley to count to 5. He adjusted Ethan Cole's cable twice. When he reached Claire, he clipped the microphone to her sweater without looking at the receiver. "Doesn't matter," he muttered as he turned away. "She probably won't say much." One young producer whispered near the backstage curtains, "She looks terrified." Another quietly laughed. "This is going to be brutal." Claire heard them. For a brief second, her fingers tightened around the edge of the leather folder. Inside it, beneath neatly clipped documents, rested a faded photograph she had almost left at home. 3 people stood in the photo outside a federal office building on a rainy afternoon. Claire was younger then. Beside her was Daniel Morris, a senior analyst with tired eyes and a habit of correcting grammar in government memos. He had once told her, quietly and without drama, that truth had no power unless someone was willing to carry it past the door where everyone else stopped. Daniel had not been a hero when Claire first met him. He had been a tired analyst with coffee stains on his sleeves and a habit of checking every number twice before signing his name. That was what made his ruin harder to forget. He had not tried to become famous. He had only tried to be honest. Daniel had lost his career within 6 months. Claire lowered her eyes, smoothed the folder once, and continued organizing her notes with careful precision. On the top page, a small crease ran through the margin beside the first question she had prepared. She pressed it flat with her thumb, slowly, patiently, until the paper obeyed. Around her, expensive suits laughed under expensive lights. Claire kept smoothing the page. Large digital screens flashed the debate title across the theater walls. The Future of America. Who should be trusted? Applause erupted as Victor Hale stepped forward and spread his arms dramatically toward the audience. "Good evening, America," he announced smoothly, his voice carrying effortless authority. "Tonight, we have economists, political strategists, former prosecutors, elected officials." He paused deliberately as his eyes drifted toward Claire. "And apparently community representatives." Scattered laughter rippled through the audience. Victor smiled slightly, allowing the moment to breathe. Claire remained still. One camera zoomed closer to her face, almost searching for embarrassment. She gave none. Victor continued introducing the panel, offering glowing praise to every guest except her. Senator Rebecca Langley was one of the sharpest legislative minds in Washington. Media strategist Owen Price was a man who understands public messaging better than almost anyone alive. Former prosecutor Ethan Cole was a guardian of legal seriousness in an unserious age. By the time Victor reached Claire, his tone had shifted into something dangerously polite. "And joining us tonight," he said, "is Claire Bennett from the Eastbrook Community Council." He tilted his head slightly. "Claire, we are very happy you could join the grown-up conversation." The audience laughed louder this time. Even a few panelists smirked. Claire offered a small nod. "Thank you for having me." Her voice was soft, controlled, almost too calm for television. Victor leaned back in his chair, already amused. In his mind, she was harmless filler. Someone easy to interrupt, easy to embarrass, easy to turn into a clip by morning. The debate officially began at exactly 8 o'clock Eastern Time, and within seconds Victor Hale took complete control of the room the way conductors command orchestras. His voice moved smoothly between statistics, jokes, and loaded questions designed to corner guests before they realized they had entered a trap. The screens behind him flashed charts and headlines while audience members nodded along, hanging on to every word with the kind of admiration television manufactures when confidence is mistaken for truth. Claire sat quietly at the far end of the curved panel desk, almost disappearing beneath the glow of the stage lights and the louder personalities surrounding her. To America watching from home, she looked out of place. Every other guest wore tailored clothing and carried themselves with rehearsed certainty. Senator Langley spoke with sharp precision about federal spending. Owen Price interrupted constantly with polished outrage. Ethan Cole leaned back with the smug expression of a man who had spent years believing his intelligence made him immune to correction. Claire simply listened. She wrote small notes in the margins of her legal pad, while the others spoke over one another like performers fighting for screen time. Whenever the argument grew loud enough to blur into theater, Claire's index finger returned to the crease in her notes and pressed it straight again. Several times, she slightly raised her hand, attempting to respond to claims about constitutional reform and public oversight committees. Each time, Victor either redirected the conversation or spoke directly over her without even pretending to acknowledge it. "Excellent point, Senator," he said loudly during one exchange, even though Claire had been trying to answer the question directed toward the panel. The audience applauded. Claire lowered her hand again. During a commercial break, a makeup assistant rushed toward Victor with blotting powder while another producer approached Claire with forced politeness. "Try to look more engaged when the others are speaking," the young producer whispered. "The network wants stronger reactions from everyone on camera." Claire nodded once. "Of course." Back on air, Victor leaned forward as the discussion shifted toward government transparency and misuse of public funds. "Now this," he announced with theatrical excitement, "is where things get interesting." The crowd responded immediately. Claire looked toward him carefully for the first time all evening. Something in his tone had changed. Victor smiled toward Ethan Cole. "Ethan, you prosecuted corruption cases for over 20 years. Tell us honestly, is the American public becoming too emotional to separate facts from conspiracy theories?" Ethan smirked confidently. "Absolutely. Most people do not understand how policy actually works." He glanced briefly toward Claire before continuing. "They read headlines, watch social media clips, and suddenly think they are constitutional scholars." Soft laughter spread across the audience. Victor grinned. "Speaking of constitutional scholars," he said, turning toward Claire with exaggerated curiosity. "Claire, I am genuinely interested. From your perspective as a community council representative, What qualifies someone to challenge experts on national policy? The room shifted subtly. It was no longer a question. It was bait. Claire looked toward Victor calmly. I believe citizens have the right to question systems that affect their lives. Victor tilted his head with a patronizing smile. That is a very thoughtful answer. His tone made it sound like he was complimenting a child. But surely you would agree expertise still matters. Claire opened her mouth slightly to continue, but Victor turned away before she could finish. Senator Langley, your thoughts? The audience laughed again. One camera briefly caught Claire sitting in silence, while the others continued debating around her as though she no longer existed. But something had changed behind her eyes. The quiet expression remained. The calm posture remained. Yet beneath the surface, Claire Bennett had begun paying very close attention to every word Victor Hale was saying. And for the first time all night, she stopped writing notes and simply listened. Let us simplify this conversation, he announced while pacing across the polished floor. Americans are tired of being lectured by activists and unelected watchdog groups pretending they understand governance better than elected officials. Applause erupted. Claire watched him carefully now, her expression unreadable. The giant screens behind the panel flashed graphics discussing federal transparency programs and oversight investigations. Victor turned dramatically toward Claire once more. Claire, he said with exaggerated patience, you have repeatedly implied tonight that ordinary citizens should challenge institutional authority. But do you honestly believe public suspicion should outweigh expertise and legal process? Claire leaned slightly toward her microphone. I believe accountability matters when power operates without transparency. Victor smiled instantly, as though she had walked into a trap. Accountability, he repeated slowly for the audience. That sounds wonderful in theory. But the problem with people who romanticize accountability is that they usually have no experience managing real systems. Ethan leaned back with amusement. Senator Langley crossed her arms. Claire remained calm. Transparency is not romantic, she answered quietly. It is necessary. Victor laughed softly under his breath before glancing toward the audience cameras. You know, this is exactly why modern discourse has become impossible. Everyone believes they are qualified to dismantle institutions simply because they feel strongly about something. The crowd applauded again. Claire attempted to respond, but Victor raised a hand and cut her off. No, let me finish. His voice sharpened slightly beneath the charm. You have not worked inside federal policy. You have not prosecuted corruption cases. You have not held elected office. So perhaps humility should enter the conversation somewhere. A hush settled over the studio. Even some audience members shifted uncomfortably at the directness of the insult. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment. Not from shame, from recognition. She had seen men like Victor her entire life. Men who mistook volume for intelligence. Men who weaponized confidence because they had never encountered someone capable of quietly exposing them. Still, the insult found its mark. Her thumb brushed the edge of the folder again, and for half a second she heard Daniel Morris speaking in a windowless conference room years earlier. They will not call you credible until they need your silence. Victor saw the numbers climbing on the live ratings feed near the cameras and grew bolder. Actually, he said suddenly, stopping near Claire's podium, I think this might help our viewers understand the issue better. A large document appeared across the massive digital screens behind them. Pages of highlighted text filled the studio walls beneath an official federal seal. Victor folded his hands confidently. This, he announced, is an internal oversight report regarding corruption investigations that were later dismissed due to lack of evidence. He looked directly at Claire. Since accountability matters so much to you, perhaps you can explain why public distrust continues even after legal experts close these cases. Claire looked up at the document. For the first time all evening, her eyes narrowed. The room sensed the shift immediately, though nobody understood why. Victor mistook her silence for fear. Take your time, he said smugly. I know legal documents can look intimidating. Scattered laughter spread across the audience. But Claire was no longer listening to them. Her attention remained fixed on the report glowing behind Victor Hale. She had not come to expose him. She had come to speak carefully, responsibly, within the limits of what the law still allowed. She had come to argue that citizens deserve transparency without dragging old wounds into a spectacle. But Victor had put the altered document on the screen himself. He had carried the buried thing into the light and mistaken it for a weapon. Victor smiled toward the audience. Do not worry. These reports can be difficult to interpret without legal training. Laughter scattered lightly through the theater once more. Claire finally lifted her eyes from the screen. Where did you get this document? She asked quietly. Victor raised an eyebrow. That is your response. More laughter followed. Interesting strategy. Claire did not react. I asked where you got it. Something in her tone caused the amusement in the room to soften. Victor noticed it immediately and moved to regain momentum. The report was provided through sources connected to the Oversight Committee, he answered smoothly. Completely verified. Claire looked back at the screen. No, she said calmly. It was not. The room shifted. It was subtle at first. A pause. A hesitation. Victor gave a small laugh. And how exactly would you know that? Claire rested her hands lightly against the podium. Because the formatting is wrong. A few audience members exchanged confused glances. Victor smiled wider, sensing what he assumed was desperation. Formatting, he repeated mockingly. Ladies and gentlemen, we have moved from constitutional theory to graphic design analysis. The crowd laughed again, but weaker this time. Claire continued speaking softly, almost as though she had forgotten the cameras existed. Federal oversight reports issued before 2019 used left-aligned authentication codes. This one uses centered formatting introduced after the committee was reorganized. Victor's smile flickered. Claire looked toward the highlighted sections of the document. The seal placement is also incorrect, and page 3 references procedural language that did not legally exist at the time this investigation was supposedly closed. Victor stepped forward too quickly. That is absurd. Claire turned toward him with steady eyes. Is it? The audience was quieter now. Even the people who had laughed moments earlier no longer seemed certain what was happening. Backstage, producers leaned closer to their monitors while assistants searched for source confirmations. Victor straightened his tie. Claire, I think you are misunderstanding the purpose of this segment. No, she replied calmly. I understand it perfectly. The silence after that sentence felt heavier than anything spoken all evening. Claire reached for her notebook and opened it without hurry. You said this report was verified, but the case referenced here was never dismissed due to lack of evidence. Victor crossed his arms. That is publicly documented. Claire nodded slightly. Yes, publicly documented after sealed testimony was altered during committee review. A wave of murmurs spread across the audience. Victor's expression tightened for the first time since the debate began. You are making a serious accusation on live television. Claire looked directly at him. No, Victor. She spoke his first name softly, and somehow that made the moment more uncomfortable. I am correcting one. The room went completely silent. Somewhere backstage, a producer whispered, Who is this woman? Victor tried to laugh again, but the confidence was beginning to crack around the edges. You are speaking as though you were involved in the investigation. Claire closed her notebook carefully. I was. The atmosphere inside the studio changed instantly. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, unmistakable way a room changes when people suddenly realize they may have misunderstood someone entirely. Victor forced a smile toward the cameras. Well, that is certainly an interesting claim. His voice almost sounded normal again. Almost. Claire did not answer immediately. She simply looked toward the oversized document still glowing across the studio screens. It is not a claim, she said quietly. I helped write the original review findings before they were revised. A ripple moved through the audience like wind through tall grass. Ethan Cole leaned forward now, no longer amused. Revised by whom? He asked carefully. Claire's eyes shifted toward the former prosecutor. Members of the Oversight Committee and external advisors. Victor immediately interrupted. Allegedly. Claire turned fully toward him. No. Documented. The room went still again. Victor crossed his arms tighter. If such documentation existed, it would have surfaced years ago. Claire nodded once. It almost did. Victor sensed the momentum slipping away and moved quickly to regain it. Let us be careful here. This is exactly how misinformation spreads. Vague accusations. Implied conspiracies. Emotional storytelling. Claire remained calm beneath his rising frustration. You invited me here to discuss accountability. And we are discussing it. No. Claire answered softly. You were performing it. The audience reacted with an audible murmur. Victor's jaw tightened. He was no longer speaking like a host enjoying a spectacle. He was speaking like a man trying to close a door before something escaped through it. "Claire," he said firmly, "if you are suggesting federal misconduct on live television, then you need evidence." Claire looked at him for several long seconds. The cameras did not move. Nobody in the audience made a sound. Even the producers backstage had stopped talking. She reached slowly into her leather folder and removed a thin stack of papers clipped neatly together. Beneath them, the faded photograph slipped halfway into view. Claire saw Daniel's face for one brief second before she covered it again with her palm. Victor's expression changed instantly. Not panic. Not yet. Recognition. Claire placed the papers gently onto the glass podium. "I brought evidence," she said. Somewhere behind the cameras, a producer whispered a curse under his breath. Victor's composure cracked for less than a second before he recovered. "Those could be anything." Claire nodded slightly. "Yes, that is why I did not plan to show them tonight." The room seemed to hold its breath. But after spending the last 40 minutes being interrupted, dismissed, and publicly treated as though I do not understand the system, she lifted her eyes toward Victor again. "I think America deserves context." The atmosphere shifted completely. No laughter remained. No smug smiles. Only tension. Victor looked toward the control booth offstage for the first time all evening. And that single glance told everyone watching one very important thing. The man who had spent years humiliating guests on national television was suddenly afraid of what a quiet woman might say next. Victor stared at the documents resting on Claire's podium as though he already understood the danger hidden inside them. The lights suddenly felt harsher, exposing every flicker of tension across his face. For years he had mastered the art of controlling conversations before they could threaten him. He interrupted, redirected, mocked, pressured. Tonight, none of those tricks were working. Claire remained seated while the studio waited. A senior producer quietly ordered staff to prepare for an emergency commercial break if necessary. Nobody moved yet. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever was unfolding. Claire rested one hand gently against the papers. 3 years ago, she began softly, a federal review board opened an internal investigation involving Oversight Committee funding allocations. The investigation uncovered irregular transfers connected to private consulting firms. Ethan Cole frowned immediately. Senator Langley looked toward Victor. Several reports were rewritten before publication. Victor interrupted again. "That is an extremely serious allegation." Claire looked at him. "Yes, it was." The silence after that sentence settled heavily across the room. Victor forced a sharp laugh. "And I suppose you expect viewers to believe you were somehow secretly involved in rewriting federal investigations?" Claire nodded once. "I was part of the legal advisory team assigned to document procedural inconsistencies before the final review." A producer backstage whispered, "Oh my God." Victor stepped forward. "If that were true, your name would appear publicly somewhere." Claire's eyes never left his. "No, it would not." Victor opened his mouth, but stopped. "Advisors working under sealed consultation agreements are often omitted from public release copies," Claire continued. Ethan slowly leaned closer to his microphone. "That is accurate," he admitted quietly. The room shifted again. Victor immediately turned toward Ethan. "Let us not validate unsupported claims here." But Ethan no longer looked certain. Something old had moved behind his eyes, something uncomfortable and unwelcome. He had seen authorization marks like the ones Claire described. Years earlier, on a case he had allowed himself to call closed because calling it anything else would have required courage he did not have then. Claire carefully lifted the top page from the stack. "You asked for evidence. This is the original. Authentication review summary submitted before revisions were approved." One of the cameras zoomed toward the page in her hand. Victor's expression tightened instantly. "There are signatures missing from the televised version displayed behind you tonight," Claire said. Victor's jaw hardened. "Where exactly did you obtain those files?" Claire looked almost saddened by the question. "You still think that is the important part?" Nobody laughed this time. The studio had become so quiet that even the faint hum of production equipment could be heard beneath the lights. "What matters," Claire continued, "is that the report shown tonight removed references to external pressure from media consultants connected to public narrative management." Victor's face lost color almost imperceptibly. Senator Langley slowly turned toward him. Ethan narrowed his eyes. The same narrative management strategies later became common in televised political coverage. Victor suddenly smiled again, but the confidence looked forced. Claire, you are implying media manipulation on national television. Claire nodded gently. No, she paused. I am describing it. The room froze completely. Victor Hale looked directly at Claire Bennett, and for the first time all evening, the powerful television host no longer appeared amused by the quiet woman sitting across from him. He looked cornered. On stage, Victor forced another smile toward the cameras. Ladies and gentlemen, this conversation has clearly become emotional. Claire looked at him steadily. Facts are not emotional. A few audience members actually applauded before quickly stopping themselves. Victor noticed. His eyes narrowed slightly. Then let us focus on facts, he said. You claim reports were altered. You claim narratives were manipulated. Yet somehow none of this became public until tonight. Claire folded her hands again. Because the people involved were powerful. Victor spread his arms dramatically. And now suddenly one quiet consultant appears on national television with secret files. Claire's expression did not change. No, I appeared because your producers invited me to discuss public accountability. Victor's jaw tightened. You simply assumed I would not understand the conversation, she said. The room fell silent again. Ethan Cole slowly removed his glasses and looked down at the documents on Claire's podium. Senator Langley no longer looked comfortable sitting beside Victor Hale. The shift in body language alone told viewers everything they needed to know. Victor tried again. If your claims were credible, surely formal action would have been taken already. Claire looked toward the giant screens behind him. Formal action was recommended. Victor froze almost imperceptibly. The recommendation disappeared during final review. A producer backstage whispered, "This is unbelievable." Victor laughed suddenly, but it sounded hollow now. You expect people to believe entire federal recommendations simply vanished. Claire reached toward the stack of papers and pulled out a single page with highlighted notes covering the margins. Not vanished, she corrected. Rewritten. She held the document up just enough for nearby cameras to capture it. Ethan leaned forward sharply. Wait, he muttered under his breath. Claire glanced toward him. You recognize the initials at the bottom. Ethan stared at the page for several seconds before slowly looking toward Victor Hale. Those are internal review authorization marks, he admitted quietly. The room reacted instantly. Audience members began whispering openly now. Victor stepped forward quickly. That proves nothing. Claire nodded once. You are right. The initials alone prove nothing. Victor looked relieved for half a second. Then Claire spoke again. The problem is the authorization code attached to them. The relief disappeared from his face. Claire's voice remained calm and almost gentle. The code traces directly to a media advisory consultant assigned to your network during the same period the reports were revised. Complete silence crashed over the studio. One camera operator lowered his camera slightly in disbelief. Ethan stared at Victor. Senator Langley looked stunned. Backstage, several producers stopped speaking altogether. Victor Hale no longer looked like the untouchable moderator who had opened the night mocking a quiet woman in a cream-colored sweater. He looked like a man realizing the conversation he tried to control had become something far more dangerous than television. The studio no longer felt like a television set. It felt like a courtroom moments before a verdict. Victor tried one final time to regain authority. Let us all remember, he said carefully, that accusations without full context can destroy reputations. Claire looked toward him almost sympathetically. You seemed less concerned about reputations earlier tonight. A few audience members gasped softly. Victor ignored them. You are implying coordinated misconduct involving media consultants, federal advisors, and oversight committees. Claire nodded once. Because that is what happened. Victor spread his hands dramatically toward the audience again. And somehow you alone uncovered all of this. Claire remained perfectly still. No, I was one of several people who tried to stop it. The room fell silent again. Ethan stared at her now with open disbelief. Why did nobody come forward publicly? He asked quietly. Claire's eyes drifted downward for a moment. This time the movement was not strategic. It was human. Some people lost careers, she answered softly. Some signed silence agreements. Some decided protecting their families mattered more than fighting powerful institutions. Her voice never broke, but her hand moved once toward the leather folder. One man tried to bring the original findings forward, she continued. After that, every door in Washington closed to him. He sold his house. He stopped answering calls. His daughter once asked me why telling the truth made her father disappear from his own life. Nobody moved. Victor immediately interrupted, but his voice was weaker now. Convenient. Claire looked directly at him. No, another pause. Painful. The room froze once more. Even Victor seemed momentarily unsure how to respond. Claire slowly reached toward the final document resting inside her folder. The movement alone caused visible tension backstage. One producer whispered urgently into a headset, "If she shows that page, this becomes a legal disaster." Claire lifted the document carefully and placed it flat against the podium beneath the lights. "You keep asking where the documents came from," she said, "but you have not once asked whether the people hurt by them ever recovered." Nobody answered. "This page is the internal communication summary attached to the revised authorization," Claire continued. "It links the final changes to Strategic Communications Review at your network." Ethan leaned forward sharply. Senator Langley looked visibly pale. Victor stepped toward Claire. "You cannot authenticate that document on live television." Claire met his eyes steadily. "Actually, I can." The room went completely silent. Claire pointed gently toward the lower corner of the page. "That registry number was assigned to your media advisory consultant." Ethan looked directly at Victor. "Is that true?" Victor hesitated, just for 1 second. But on live television, 1 second can destroy an illusion built over decades. The audience noticed it. Claire noticed it too. She lowered her hand slowly from the document. "You asked earlier why public trust keeps collapsing," she said quietly. "This is why." Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Victor Hale, the man who had spent years humiliating guests with confidence and control, stood speechless beneath the bright studio lights while the quiet woman he dismissed calmly exposed the very system he once mocked others for questioning. Then Claire finally said the sentence that shattered whatever remained of his authority. "The problem was never that Americans stopped trusting powerful people," she said softly. "The problem is that powerful people stopped telling the truth." For half a second, the room did not move. Then every red camera light above the stage went dark at once. The massive screen behind Victor flickered. The federal document vanished. The debate title flashed for one broken instant, then collapsed into black. Claire's microphone died in the middle of the silence, leaving only the dead hum of studio lights and the startled rustle of hundreds of people realizing they were no longer watching television. They were inside something the television did not want them to see. A director's voice exploded through the headsets around the stage. "Cut her mic, kill the feed. Now." One camera operator looked toward the control booth, frozen with both hands still on the rig. A floor manager stepped forward, then stopped, as if his body had received 2 different orders at the same time. The audience did not applaud. No one stood. No one cheered. The absence of sound became heavier than any ovation could have been. Victor turned toward camera 2 out of pure instinct, searching for the red light that had made him powerful for 27 years. It was gone. Without it, his smile had nowhere to perform. Ethan Cole slowly removed his microphone, not as a gesture for the broadcast, but because the broadcast was already dead. Senator Langley stared at the blank screen behind Victor. The woman in the third row, the same woman who had laughed at Claire less than an hour earlier, lowered her eyes as though the darkness had finally given her permission to feel ashamed. Claire did not look surprised. She looked down at the folder. For the first time that night, her thumb rested over the faded corner of Daniel Morris's photograph. When she lifted her eyes again, her voice was no longer being carried by microphones, but the front rows heard it anyway. "Because the last person who tried to say this alone lost everything," she said. "And because people stopped listening to quiet voices unless they were forced to." Victor heard it. Ethan heard it. The woman in the third row heard it. The network did not broadcast it, but that did not make it unsaid. Emergency lights along the aisle brightened to a dim gold. Producers rushed from the wings, speaking too quickly into phones. Someone ordered the audience to remain seated. Someone else shouted that no one was allowed to record. But dozens of phones were already in hands, their small screens glowing like scattered witnesses in the dark. Claire calmly gathered her papers back into the leather folder she had carried onto the stage at the beginning of the evening. Her movements were unhurried, precise, almost gentle. She slid the final document over Daniel's photograph, pressed the folder closed, and lifted the paper cup from beside her notes. It had gone soft in her hand. Victor finally spoke, though there was no microphone left to make him sound larger than he was. Claire. She paused, but did not turn back fully. For once, he seemed to have no question ready. Claire looked at him for a moment, not with victory and not with hatred, but with the tired pity people reserve for someone who has mistaken applause for a soul. Then she walked down from the debate stage the same way she had entered it. Quietly. No camera followed her all the way. The official broadcast had ended too soon. But someone in the back row recorded the silhouette of a woman in a cream-colored sweater moving through the emergency light with a leather folder under her arm, while behind her the most powerful room in television argued about how to pretend nothing had happened. By morning, the network blamed a technical interruption. By noon, the audience footage had spread farther than any polished segment Victor Hale had ever produced. Federal offices issued cautious statements. Executives refused direct questions. But that was not what people remembered. What they remembered was the cut. The exact second the truth became too dangerous to televise. They remembered the thin paper cup beside Claire's notes, the dead microphone on her sweater, and the blank screen behind a man who had spent his life turning other people's humiliation into content. And somewhere, in a small kitchen far from the studio lights, Daniel Morris's daughter watched a shaky phone recording and cried before Claire even reached the aisle. Because that night, America did not get the comfort of applause. It got something colder. Proof. Intelligence does not need to announce itself loudly. Dignity does not disappear simply because arrogant people fail to recognize it. And sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is not the one holding the microphone. It is the one they cut off too late.